Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Salmond. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of the United States, and I'd like to welcome you, as I assume everybody's still filing in, but I'd like to welcome you nonetheless to today's talk, The Indian Question in the United States. It's my pleasure to be here with you and to hand off to Dr. Tahseen Shams, who will do the formal introduction of Dr. Mamdani. I will proceed now to the land acknowledgement, which we do in lieu of reparations. The sacred land on which we operate has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It is marked by a history of settler colonialism and genocide, as well as resistance. It is a site from which ongoing internal and external colonial projects are launched and extended, even as their persistence and violence is erased in dominant accounts of history, especially accounts of the present day. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. 2 Row Wampum says we are going to live on this land together and respect each other's sovereignty. The Dish with One Spoon is an agreement that recognizes that we live off of the same resources. It is hard to eat a collective meal together off a dish with one spoon. Hence, protocols are put in place to ensure mutual respect and accountability to each other and to the land. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Our intersecting communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as settlers who have come here by choice, force, or otherwise a result of settler colonialism and imperialism. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 Calls to Action reaffirms that the treaties with Indigenous peoples must be lawfully honored. We are all treaty peoples and are responsible for honoring and upholding those agreements. We are grateful for the opportunity to work on this territory and to share space with all of you. A couple of upcoming events at the Center for the Study of the United States. Session 2 in Racism in the United States will be next Thursday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. The title will be Survival of Indigenous and Communities of Color in Los Angeles During a Global Pandemic and Ongoing Racial Violence. Session 3 will be the week after, 1 to 2 p.m. The Interconnected Histories of South African and American Sociology, Knowledge in the Service of Colonial Violence. And then finally, on March 30th, we have a graduate student workshop, Empire Online, the US government's reterritorialization of cyberspace after 9/11. I encourage you to check all these events out at our website, which is listed below, and we look forward to seeing you there. In today's seminar, we will be using the Q&A feature to ask questions during and at the end of the talk. The moderator will keep an eye on the Q&A and will either ask you to speak or will forward your questions to the speaker. So please use the Q&A and not the chat function. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Tahseen Shams, Professor Tahseen Shams of the Sociology Department, who will introduce the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Tahseen Shams, Assistant Professor of Sociology and the Bissell-Heyd Research Fellow of the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Toronto. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to Racisms in the United States, a 3-day public research event. Perhaps in more pertinent ways than any other time in recent memory, we are seeing the power of globalization and how it intersects with race at full display. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that what happens in a faraway foreign land does not stop at its borders, but can produce domino effects forceful enough to lock down almost the entire world. Immigrants, long been singled out as disease carriers, have once again been blamed from the world's pandemics. The coronavirus originating in China, this time xenophobia has turned its gaze on immigrants of Asian descent. At the same time, the world is witnessing massive protests against anti-Black racism in the US echo across countries as far-flung as Canada, France, Great Britain, India, and Ethiopia, showing that such domino effects are not just produced as a result of once-in-a-lifetime epidemiological crisis, but also because of socio-political dynamics that have long percolated in our societies. These events highlight how the age-old color line that still divides an us from a them are challenging America's identity as a nation. This webinar series will host a panel of distinguished scholars to situate the ongoing conversations on race, migration, and nationalism in today's global context to discuss how racisms such as Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiments, anti-Blackness, and settler colonialisms all work together to produce systemic racial disparities in the United States and abroad. The event is open for free to the public thanks to the support of the Bissell-Heyd Fellowship. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mahmoud Mamdani as the inaugural speaker of this webinar series. Dr. Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1974 and specializes in the study of African history and politics. His works explore the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. Just some of Dr. Mamdani's groundbreaking books include Saviors and Survivors, Darfur, Politics and the War on Terror, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism, and Genocide in Rwanda, and From Citizen to Refugee. His book, Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, was awarded the Herskovits Prize of the African Studies Association. For his distinguished scholarship, Dr. Mamdani has received numerous awards and recognitions, including being listed as one of the top 20 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy and Prospect Magazine in 2008. From 1998 to 2002, Dr. Mamdani also served as president of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa. Today, Dr. Mamdani will present findings from his new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, published by the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. This book is a profound and brilliant inquiry into political modernity, both colonial and post-colonial, and an exploration of the roots of extreme violence that has plagued post-colonial society. The overarching theme of today's webinar is how racisms work together in the United States and abroad. We will focus on exploring questions like how racism against one group in one country informs racism against a different group in other countries, and what factors influence transnational mobilizations on issues of race. Neither Settler Nor Native opens a new way for us to tackle these questions. For instance, one of the main arguments I found to be striking is how powerfully Dr. Mamdani shows that the nation-building projects of settler colonial states across the world, such as the United States, Germany, South Africa, Sudan, and Israel-Palestine, are not only interconnected, but are co-constitutive. We have the privilege today to hear Dr. Mamdani share his insights about the US settler colonial state. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mamdani to present his talk, The Indian Question in the United States. Thank you, Dr. Mamdani.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shams. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak to this audience, which unfortunately I cannot see, but that's in the nature of the COVID-19 era. So I'll try and stick to my time of 30 minutes. In his presidential inaugural address in January 2009, Barack Obama reflected on the country's history with a touch of unmistakable pride. Quote, "We sometimes make mistakes. We have not been perfect. But if you look at the track record, as you say, America was not born as a colonial power. Compare this innocence with the verdict rendered by Martin Luther King Jr. Quote, our nation was born in genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode." What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Though native is today considered a more politically correct designation, neither the US government nor the peoples they colonized accept that name. The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas is called the National Museum of the American Indian. What difference would it make if we were to call this museum the National Museum of the Native American? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations? The dogs are responding to what I'm saying. Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the United States in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the United States. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the United States, but it's a polity separate from the US. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants. They were settlers. What is the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the US. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, mid-19th century, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, in fact masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any direct rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. It claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different colonial solutions. One of an internal minority, the other of a minority forcibly brought in from the outside. One is based on colonial conquest, the other on racial domination. The consequences have been radically different. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if racial discrimination is common to both. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes even receded, the one-state framework made possible the development of alliances. The two-state solution explains the continued isolation and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. We can see the big difference between the two in the US. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building in a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. A delegation visited North America, USA, and Canada 2 years later to study how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland and has had one from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Every homeland, the second proposition went, every homeland has from time immemorial been administered by traditional authority, sanctioned by custom. This authority is not subject to being elected. Third proposition, this traditional authority must enforce a customary law on the homeland. The legitimacy of custom is that it too has been there from time immemorial. This time, though, settlers insisted that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. Let me return to natives and slaves in America. There is a striking contrast between the changing position of Indian natives and African slaves in the United States of America. Conquered, subjugated, and exterminated, with residual populations containerized in reservations, Indians became increasingly marginal to the course of American history. In contrast, slaves and ex-slaves have been central to the protracted struggle to deracialize American state and society. Why this radical difference? This marginalization of natives in contrast to the centralization of slaves. Is there a relationship between these contrasting outcomes? For settlers, as I have said, Indians signified land and Africans labor. For Indians, the loss of land rights was a consequence of a larger loss, that of political community. Every colony the Crown established in North America had one legal characteristic in common. The soil granted was in every case subject to the unextinguished right of occupancy of the Indian tribes. The Crown retained both the title to all lands occupied by the tribes and the exclusive right to extinguish the tribal right of occupancy. Native Americans have never been accorded the legal status of full title by the US government. The land they held was put in a different conceptual category, variously called Indian title or, quote, right of occupancy. The Constitution, too, treated the Native American differently from the African slave. Not only was the Indian, quote, from the Constitution, not a member of the new national community, he and she were seen as a threat who had to be controlled. Unlike persons of African origin who were to be mastered as individuals, Indians were enemy peoples to be conquered collectively as separate tribes. This indeed was the justification for why the US had to have a federal armed force made of settler militias. The 1866 Civil Rights Act that guaranteed the same rights to citizens explicitly excluded Indians from the roster of citizens. Even when Indians did become citizens, starting after the First World War, they were not considered citizens by birth, but by registration. Unlike other citizens of the US, Indians were defined as both citizens and wards. The Indian was thus different from the Black person. In politics, therefore in law. Blacks were captives who had to be mastered as individuals. Indians were free persons who had to be colonized in groups comprising so many tribes and nations. It is Chief Justice Marshall who elaborated and clarified key aspects of the Indian question in a set of Supreme Court rulings that spanned a decade from 1823 to 1832. His views were formulated in 3 seminal opinions in 3 crucial cases: Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, and Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. Marshall's single most important contribution was to underline federal recognition of Indian nations as, quote, domestic dependent nations. By so doing, Marshall clarified 2 related issues. As domestic dependent nations, Indians were subject to federal and not to state sovereignty. At the same time, not being part of the political community called the USA, Indians were wards who could not claim any constitutionally protected rights. In as unequivocal a confirmation as one is likely to come across in legal texts, Marshall concluded that politics trumps law. I quote from Marshall: "Conquest gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny, whatever the private and speculative opinions of individuals may be, respecting the original justice of the claim which has been successfully asserted. The British government, which was then our government and whose rights have passed to the United States, asserted title to all the lands occupied by Indians within the chartered limits of the British colonies. The title to a vast portion of the lands we now hold originates in them. It is not for the courts of this country to question the validity of this title or to sustain one which is incompatible with it." End of quote. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Marshall began by affirming that the Cherokees were indeed a state, quote, a distinct political society, separated from others, capable of managing its own affairs and governing itself. But he doubted whether these tribes can be, quote, denominated foreign nations, for they are not only territorially a part of the US, but are also within the jurisdictional limits of the US and operate under the protection of the US. He suggested they be more appropriately designated as domestic dependent nations. I quote, "They occupy a territory to which we assert a title independent of their will, which must take effect in point of possession when their right of possession ceases. Meanwhile, they are in a state of pupillage. Their relation to the US resembles that of a ward to his guardian." And then he proceeded to define the relationship between ward and guardian. Quote, "They look to our government for protection, rely upon its kindness and its power, appeal to it for relief of their wants, and address the president as their great father. They and their country are considered by foreign nations, as well as by ourselves, as being so completely under the sovereignty and dominion of the US that any attempt to acquire their lands or to form a political connection with them would be considered by all as an invasion of our territory and an act of hostility. A ward is a child in law. A ward cannot hold or claim a property right, only a right of use. A ward cannot bring independent action in courts of the US. Wards may live on the territory of the US, but they do so on sufferance of its citizens and their representative political institutions, particularly Congress. The choice for the Cherokee was between a colonial subjugation to the federal government and racial subjugation through a second-class citizenship in the state of Georgia. In mid-19th century US, the former was the lot of the Indian and the latter of blacks. To his credit, Chief Justice Marshall took the third case as an opportunity to reflect on a future outside the box, the settler conquest of the native. And I quote, "The title by conquest is acquired and maintained by force. The conqueror prescribes its limits. Humanity, however, acting on public opinion, has established a general rule. that the conquered shall not wantonly oppressed. Sorry, that the conquered shall not be wantonly oppressed, and that their condition shall remain as eligible as is compatible with the objects of the conquest. Most usually, they are incorporated within the victorious nation and become subjects or citizens of the government with which they are connected. The new and old members of the society mingle with each other. The distinction between them is gradually lost, and they make one people. Where this incorporation is practicable, humanity demands, and a wise policy requires, that the rights of the conquered to property shall remain unimpaired, that the new subjects should be governed as equitably as the old, and that confidence in their security should gradually banish the painful sense of being separated from their ancient connections and united by force to strangers. End of quote. The thought is bold. Conquest must not only draw the curtain on the independence of a previously existing political community, it must also open the possibility of creating a new political community where conqueror and conquered, whether joined or separate, shall be as equal members. But this is where Marshall hesitated. Aware that none of what he said, the unassailed right to pre-existing property, nor the humane right to participate in the making of a new commonwealth, none of this obtained in America. Aware of this, he blamed this in time-honored fashion on native culture. Quote, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. To govern them as a distinct people was impossible, because they were as brave and as high-spirited as they were fierce, and were ready to repel by arms every attempt on their independence. Thus, argued Marshall, quote, that law which regulates and ought to regulate in general the relations between the conqueror and the conquered was incapable of application to a people under such circumstances. Marshall was neither the first nor the last to rationalize settler conquest as a civilizing mission. There is a limit to the justice courts can dispense. That limit is defined by power. Courts do not establish rights. Power does. What did tribal sovereignty mean in this political context? It meant, first of all, that Indian affairs came under the jurisdiction of federal and not state government. Second, however, rather than give content to the notion of sovereignty, the notion of tribal sovereignty referred to a continuing practice of internal self-administration, rather than any real independence of administration from external forces. It defined more a de facto state of affairs, which continued only so long as it was tolerated by those in power. More a de facto state of affairs than a statement of constitutionally enforced principles. At the heart of this de facto state of affairs was a colonial regime of legal dualism that defined racially as in a colonial setup, rather than territorially as would be in a federal setup. This meant that tribal courts in Indian country had jurisdiction over Indians only and not over non-Indians, whether criminal or victim, as specified in the Intercourse Act of 1834. The tribal court's jurisdiction depended on the answer to two questions: who is an Indian and who decides? Let me come to the politics of all this, which went from a one-state solution to a two-state solution. The settler enterprise in America began with the promise of a one-state solution, with Indians entitled to separate representation in a single legislature, the US Congress. It then moved on to the idea of two states, one white, the other Indian, one each on either side of the Mississippi, except that the native state would be a protectorate of the settler state. When westward expansion in 19th century destroyed that vision, settlers crafted other, this time even more cruel futures for natives, all within an explicitly colonial context. One of these was forced assimilation, the other compulsory segregation. These continue into the present. In early treaties with Indian communities, sometimes called nations, other times tribes, both the English Crown and the US offered Indians independent representation in Congress. On the face of it, these seemed offers to coexist in political equality under a common political roof, made to all Indian tribes that pledged to coexist peacefully with whites. The first treaty of the US, then a confederation, was signed in September 1778 with the Delaware. Article 6 invited the Delaware Nation to form a state by joining with other tribes friendly to the interests of the US, and provided that the Delaware Nation shall be the heads of the state and have a representation in Congress. The Hopewell Treaty of November 28, 1785, signed with the Cherokee a few months later, contained a provision acknowledging the right of the Cherokee Nation to send a deputy of their choice, whenever they think fit, to Congress. The single state initiative resurfaced as part of the 1867-69 Southern Constitutional Conventions that swept across Reconstruction South in the wake of the Civil War. These constitutions established the South's first state-funded system of compulsory education and the first systems of providing poor relief. All guaranteed civil and political rights for Blacks. It is in the context of this equal rights revolution, as dubbed by a Texas paper, that Florida grant Seminole Indians 2 representatives in the state legislature. The single state solution envisioned Indians as becoming part of the US as a single political community. The 2-state solution was premised on the establishment of a separate state, a homeland for Indians. In his last annual message to Congress in 1825, President Monroe proposed that after their removal west of the Mississippi, the tribes could be confederated into a protectorate of the US and used to extend the influence and trade of the US westward to the Pacific. The 2-state solution called for the establishment of a colonial protectorate for Indians. The era of the 1-state solution came to a close with a genocidal bloodletting, beginning with Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the ethnic cleansing of Indians from east of Mississippi. In the Jackson era, the US pursued a dual policy: genocide of the majority and confinement of the minority. The second great wave of genocidal violence followed the Compromise of 1850 and the admission of California to the Union as a free state. In the words of Michael Rogan, the result was, quote, a genocide that concentrated in time, space, and brutality, the Jacksonian project of Indian dispossession. The modern reservation, however, came into being only in the second half of the 19th century. Its inauguration signaled the final defeat of Native Americans in North America. To install a reservation required a more or less complete subjugation of natives. The federal policy of confining Indian tribes to remote reservations was initiated by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and was then intensified by President Grant under a self-proclaimed peace policy. By the time Grant left office, the world of the Plains Indian had been shattered by a combination of the railroad, farms, ranches, Indian wars, and reservations. The population of Plains Indians had dwindled from 250,000 to a few tens of thousands. The survivors are the flip side of those who died in this slow, stretched out genocide. Today, there are more than 500 federally recognized indigenous communities and nations, comprising nearly 3 million people in the US. These are the descendants of the 15 million original inhabitants of the land, most of whom lived in towns. Indian Territory was dissolved in 1907 when the state of Oklahoma entered the Union. Some 50 indigenous nations that had been removed to Oklahoma were entirely allotted, divided up by the federal government into individual native-owned parcels. Today, there are 310 federally recognized reservations, home to 554 indigenous groups. The reservation was presented to white society both as a way of segregating the races and as a hothouse for the accelerated civilization and assimilation of Indians. Created to administer the assimilation of the Indian tribes into the American nation, the BIA turned out to be the instrument of their forced segregation into semi-captivity. BIA agents ruled the reservations without any legally imposed restraint during the plenary power era, which went from 1877 to the 1930s. Indian religions were banned upon threat of criminal prosecution in the courts of Indian offenses set up by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In practice, assimilation turned into a culture war against cultural differences, practices that distinguished Indian tribes from white neighbors, such as long hair, painted faces, Indian dress, and names difficult for white society to pronounce or remember. The reservation regime came dressed in the language of paternalism. White authorities had insisted since colonial days that Indians address them as, quote, father. From presidents to frontier governors, Indian agents, treaty commissioners, generals, secretaries of war, and superintendents of Indian affairs all referred to Indians as their children. The full brunt of the effort of re-education was directed towards Indian children, who were shipped away from the reservation or brought together at reservation schools. All were interned in reservations. None could see a future ahead. Isolation bred despair and led to some of the highest rates of suicide in the world. I want to just very briefly talk about what are known as the 5 civilized tribes. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, had moved to the west, most in the 1830s, and the Seminole, in the 1850s, where they constituted themselves as, quote, nations and proceeded to make changes under federal pressure. The contest between civilization and tradition, the former a synonym for the white man's way and the latter for the Indian way, triggered a protracted debate in their ranks. The Cherokee, for example, built a modern prison, whereas the Creeks maintained that a prison was not fitting punishment for an Indian. Of all the nations of the Indian Territory, the Creeks and Seminoles most successfully excluded whites and tried to preserve their traditional ways. The debate between civilization and tradition had the most tragic outcome among the Creeks. This nation of perhaps 10,000 people had 5 civil wars between 1860 and 1908, roughly half a century, roughly 1 civil war per decade, and on several occasions had parallel governments, one representing those calling for adaptation to civilization, and the other for those championing tradition. Following the Civil War, the Indian state in the promised 2-state solution turned into a mini-state. Oklahoma was different from other states in that its legislature was to function under a federally appointed governor who was to rule by decree. Rather than a 2-state solution, this resembled an Indian Bantustan overseen by a white state with the power to issue decrees. The Cherokee and the Choctaw most readily adapted to the creation of a new legal and political institutions parallel to those in the US. At the heart of their forced assimilation was a program of compulsory decollectivization, which turned out to be a way of forcibly appropriating Indian lands. Let me come to a close. If Marshall could see no future for Native American communities beyond a perpetual colonial condition, Supreme Court justices like Taney explored the possibility of individual futures beyond colonial subjugation. Taney wrote in Dred Scott in 1856 that even though Indian tribes had not historically formed a part of the colonial communities and had never amalgamated with them, and though the Indians were uncivilized, all these are in quotes, the course of events had brought them under subjugation to the white race. And it has been found necessary, said he, for their sake as well as our own, to disregard them as in a state of pupillage, and to legislate to a certain extent over them and over the territories they occupied. Following a trajectory well laid by Marshall's model of guardian ward principle, Taney noted that Indians could only become naturalized as citizens under the laws of the US by abandoning their ties to the savage tribes and taking up abode among the white population. The alternative Taney offered would today be termed ethnocide, the erasure of their group identity in favor of forced assimilation into white society as individual citizens of the US. Citizenship was first thought of with reference to the civilized tribes and as an alternative to the promised two-state solution. The formal grant of citizenship to Native Americans took place over 2 decades, from 1901 to 1924, starting with those who had joined the armed services. As citizens, Indians form a category of their own. At least 2 limitations set them apart from other native-born American citizens. The first and the central limitation to Indian citizenship is that Indians remain legal wards of the US. Indians are only citizens without rights constitutionally guaranteed and enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Second, unlike other persons born in the US, Indians are not considered citizens by birth. They have to be naturalized. There is little doubt that the objective of US colonial authorities was to terminate the existence of Native Americans as peoples, but not really to eliminate each individual. When it comes to survivors, colonial paternalism has sought to extinguish Indian agency in any meaningful sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mamdani, for that really, not just interesting, but really eye-opening talk, and especially connecting this American nation-building project with some of the other projects that you mentioned. I think in Germany, in South Africa, and elsewhere, I ask everyone in the audience if they have any questions to please ask them using the Q&A function. While we wait for questions to come in, I would like to ask you a question myself, Dr. Mamdani. One of the things that in your talk I found very striking, you said that courts do not dispense justice, power does. And I think it goes back to your critique of human rights as a discourse for those seeking justice against settler colonialisms. In your book, you argued that human rights denies the existence of history, instead looking only to the here and now and asking who did what to whom, so that perpetrators may be punished and victims vindicated. And then you go on to say, what these activists really seek to do is understand why the atrocities happened or what they tell us about the political community. And then later on, you also say that I don't pretend to know exactly what this next world will look like. Decolonizing the political is nothing less than reimagining the order of the nation state. But you did prescribe some recommendations. I was wondering if you could tell us and the audience a little bit more about what this would look like in real life, this shift away from human rights. What would be the way forward if you want to decolonize the political community and seek justice for Native Americans?
Well, very briefly, I put forward two issues when it comes to human rights. The human rights perspective was packaged, put together, and presented at the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were said to be innovative for one particular reason. They did not consider crimes to be state crimes. They considered crimes to be crimes of individuals, even when these individuals were agents of the state. And therefore, Nuremberg argued that every individual, even if employed by the state, must be punished and be held accountable for the crime. In the process, however, human rights completely depoliticized, not human rights, but Nuremberg completely depoliticized state violence. By treating all violence as criminal violence, Nuremberg basically established a principle. The principle was that you cannot hold the state accountable for violence. Crime, by definition, is a crime against the state. The state cannot commit crimes. That's one issue. Second is that if you think of violence, now my book is not about violence committed by individuals in what we call the pursuit of, in the waging of a crime. My book is about large-scale violence, extreme violence. And I argue that if you want to bring extreme violence to an end, you cannot do so by simply identifying perpetrators and holding them accountable. Because extreme violence is not a standalone violence. It's not a one-off, one-time violence. Extreme violence tends to be more representative of a cycle of violence. Extreme violence may be perpetrated by individuals, but it is not really organized by individuals. It has its own constituencies, and constituencies are mobilized around issues. So if you want to bring large-scale violence, what I call political violence, to an end, you have to focus on issues rather than perpetrators. And by focusing on issues, you have to bring to the fore the grievances of both sides. You have to understand that if there's a cycle of violence, victims and perpetrators are often likely to change sides. If you focus on perpetrators, you will never understand the issues around which they mobilize. Extreme violence to me is, in cases that I've examined, a product of exclusion from political community. And the antidote to extreme violence, first and foremost, is a reform of the political community. A reform of the political community with a view to include those who had been excluded. I give the example of South Africa here, and I contrast the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with the talks which were held at the CODESA talks at Kempton Park. The TRC was like a latter-day Nuremberg, except that it did not promise crime and punishment. It promised crime and forgiveness. But like Nuremberg, it concentrated on individuals. And it asked those individuals to apologize for their crimes, in return for which they would be forgiven. But it was never able to figure out the question of violence as state violence, the question of why the violence. it always looked like either the individuals concerned were committing violence, either because they were greedy after endless pursuit of some gain, or because they were psychically damaged in some way. Contrast this with Kempton Park. Kempton Park was not interested in identifying individuals. Kempton Park was about bringing different participants, organized groups in the violence together around the table. By identifying key issues and by negotiating a reformed political community in which those who had been excluded would be included. So in very brief terms, I say that even though the number of Indians left, whether in North America, whether in the US or Canada, I would say, are few in numbers, not that many. The Indian communities have to be brought within the fold of the US as a political community, but not within the fold of the US as it exists today, within the fold of a reformed political community, so that Indian reservations, whether they are merged or into one or two or several, get the same kind of autonomy as do Indian states, where rights in the Indian communities are not based on custom, which distinguishes between an Indian who is indigenous to the reservation and another Indian who is not indigenous to the reservation. This homage to custom, in fact, serves to perpetuate a fragmentation of Indians and hostility between one fragment and another. I do not give any detailed kind of prescription because I do not believe that detailed prescriptions can come from the pen of a scholar or the study of an intellectual or a college professor. I believe that the raw material has to be found on the ground. And the job of a scholar is to systematize what is on the ground, because what is on the ground is often contradictory, to systematize it into a more consistent point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mamdani. We already have questions from the audience trickling in now. Alejandro Paz asks, first says, thank you, Professor Mamdani, for the stimulating talk. You mentioned other countries that studied the US system of colonial subjugation, South Africa and Israel, for example. In the case of the United States, you mentioned the politicians and intellectuals, judges, etc., that oversaw the shift from the one state to the two-state solution. Did they study models from elsewhere when coming to their proposed solutions?
Well, I think there was one previous experience which could have given them, and which most likely did give them, most likely inform their quote solution. And this model was that of Ireland, the British in Ireland. The British in Ireland, their ambition was to create reservations. Their ambition was to extinguish Irish ways of being and to displace this mainly by the Episcopal Church, to also displace Irish non-religious culture, and displace this by its English variant, to also remove Irish leadership and to put in place those appointed by the English. But the thing is that in Ireland, the English were never able to achieve this project, because to achieve it required a total subjugation of the native population, which they were not able to do. To achieve it also required access to resources, which they did not have. The question of scalping, for example, originated in Ireland, and it was brought from that practice was I don't want to say brought, but at least was informed by the Irish president earlier on. So it's partly learning from what was imagined in Ireland, but not quite executed, but also partly from their own understanding of how to proceed. More of a trial and error process.
Thank you, Dr. Mamdani, for answering that question. We have another question from Atif Khan, which unfortunately has to be our last question today from the audience. Atif Khan asks, hello, Professor Mamdani. Thank you so much for this talk and all your previous work. My question is in thinking beyond the nation state colonial state. For those of us working on questions of large-scale violence, such as war, do you have advice for emerging scholars on how one writes about violence? What are the limits of narrating violence on paper?
Look, there are two questions here. Thinking beyond the nation state. Okay. I argue in the book that the nation state project actually begins in 1492, not with the Treaty of Westphalia, as is commonly argued. It's in 1492 in the Iberian Peninsula that a political project to create a state, as the slogan went then, one nation, one territory, one religion. That political project was implemented. The result was a mass expulsion of most of the Muslims and Jews, and a forcible conversion of those who remained. This is the non-liberal notion of the nation state. It led to religious wars, wars between majorities and minorities for almost a century. The Treaty of Westphalia was an attempt to find an antidote, a solution to this. And Westphalia came up with two propositions. One proposition was that each nation state establish a policy of tolerance in dealing with its national minorities. And second proposition, that in return for this policy of tolerance, this nation state be acknowledged as sovereign in the international community, which at that time was basically the European community. Now, this point of view was theorized in John Locke's essay on tolerance. And John Locke basically argued that Protestants, the Protestant majority in England, should tolerate the Catholics, provided the Catholics did not pay homage to the Pope or to any other political power outside England. So in John Locke's notion, and as had been put into practice in the Treaty of Westphalia, the nation state comprised two political groups. One was the majority was sovereign. The other was the minority was non-sovereign. So my argument in the book was that the problem is really the joining of the nation with the state. It is the joining of the nation with the state which turns diversity into a problem. And sooner or later, this nation state begins to liquidate diversity as a political project. whether that liquidation is non-liberal, as with Hitler, or whether it is liberal, as with tolerance of minorities who have rights but not power, as in contemporary Israel, for example, as in Pakistan after partition, as in India after partition. Now India is moving to a non-liberal state. So not my solution, I don't know it's a solution, but my suggestion as a way forward was that we must decouple the state of the nation in order to ensure a healthy climate for diversity. There should be no identification of a group which has sovereign rights and other groups which don't have sovereign rights. In fact, the diversity must be reflected within the state. Through what arrangements, I don't say. Again, I say that this needs to be worked out in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mamdani, for answering our questions, for giving us this very eye-opening talk. I encourage everyone to read Dr. Mamdani's book. It is one of the most profound books I've read in recent years. Thank you very much for your scholarship, Dr. Mamdani. We do have some questions from the audience asking us if there is a way for all of us to keep track of your online talks. Can you direct us to any website where we can sign up for forthcoming events about your work?
Oh my God, I hadn't thought of this. I don't know, I'll keep the question ticking in my mind, but I don't have I mean, I have a whole series of commitments to give talks, and what I can do is to send you the list that I have, and then you can figure out where and how to access these talks.
Yes, and Dr. Mamdani, you also have a Twitter account. I direct our audience members who are interested to also follow Dr. Mamdani on Twitter, where he often posts forthcoming talks and podcast interviews and book talks. Thank you so much again, Dr. Mamdani. We are a little over the hour. Nick, would you like to close us off?
I just wanted to thank Professor Mamdani and to say that we can post those upcoming events, talks of his, in the next 2 events that we have in the Bissell-Heyd series easily. And to thank you so much for a really stimulating talk. I'm very, very grateful for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you whose faces I can't see and the 2 faces I can see. Thank you.